And so we come to what is probably the most significant occurrence in Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and that's what's referred to by the book as the Louisiana Godsend. Now, keep in mind, you have the territory, what we know today as the Louisiana Territory. Now, that land had been owned by France, and then at the end of the Seven Years' War, I'm sorry, the French and Indian War, that land was ceded to Spain. Okay, so France has totally left all of its holdings in North America with a few, exceptions like in the Caribbean, and that land is now going to belong to Spain. So Spain is going to be ruling that for a while. Keep in mind, this is about 1800. Napoleon is starting to really roll across Europe. He looks like he is all but unstoppable. And he goes into some secret negotiations, some secret discussions with the King of Spain. And what he's trying to get Spain to do is to give all that land, which had once belonged to France, back to France. Now, you got to keep in mind that France had no real territorial ambitions per se in regards to North America. But having the Louisiana Territory was kind of like, having a winning lottery ticket. You had the ability to use it in various ways that would benefit you in the long run. And that's what Napoleon was looking at. He was thinking about this as sort of a long term investment, for lack of a better term. Then in 1802, the Spanish at New Orleans withdrew the right of deposit, which had been guaranteed by the Pinckney Treaty back in 1795. Now, you may ask, what is the right of deposit? It's essentially warehousing privileges. Okay, if you are a farmer, okay, you're living out there on the frontier, what you do is you can build a raft or something, you can load up your stuff, you float it downriver, down the Mississippi River, and then in New Orleans, you would put it in warehouses until it could be loaded onto an ocean-going vessel. Now, if they didn't have the ability to put their goods into the various warehouses, it meant that they weren't going to be able to conduct as much trade, or that the harvest would go bad, or something along those lines. So it was really a blow to the face of the farmers that they were not going to be allowed to really trade their goods anymore. Now, this deposit privilege was vital to the farmers on the frontier. Without that, they didn't have a market. They had no one who could actually buy the crops they were raising for the purpose of sale. It wasn't just a cash crop per se. They were raising crops for their own, use for, eating and things like that. But they were growing excess so that they could sell. Okay, so they would float all these crops down the river and then wait until they could be, transported elsewhere. These farmers actually began talk of marching on the city of New Orleans to violently get back what they deserved. Now, had they done this, the United States almost certainly would have been plunged into a war with both Spain and France at the same time. And if you recall, we already talked about the fact that Jefferson had a fear of a standing military, and so the military had been reduced rather significantly. There is no way, had we gone to war with France and Spain, that we would have been able to actually, hold our own. So the good news is that the farmers did not march on New Orleans, and we did not go to war with France and Spain at that point in time. Now, in 1803, President Jefferson thought maybe they had come up with a way to deal with the situation. Okay, 1803, President Jefferson sends James Monroe to join the regular minister, sort of like an ambassador, Robert Livingston, with the purpose of trying to buy New Orleans. Okay, they wanted to buy the city of New Orleans and as much land east of the river as possible. And if they were able to do so, he was willing to spend up to $10 million. Okay, now $10 million, still not an insignificant sum today, but back then was a sizable chunk of money. In terms of today's money, we're looking at about $172 million. So it is a sizable chunk of money, like I was saying. But it would be worth it. The thinking was if they could go through and they could actually purchase New Orleans, then they would control the mouth of the Mississippi River. Therefore, they would be able to control river traffic, and there would be no issue of, the farmers being able to actually keep their stuff there. There would no longer be the issue of deposit. So they go off with the hopes that they can get away with only spending $10 million and get the entire city. At least that was the hope. But that wasn't what happened. Napoleon had a different offer that may or may not have worked out, to his advantage and to Jefferson's advantage, he thought. Napoleon offered to sell not just the city of New Orleans, but all of the land west of it. Now, we had been willing to pay $10 million for New Orleans and the land east of that. Napoleon was willing to sell us New Orleans and all the land of the Louisiana Purchase, basically going from the Mississippi River out to the Rocky Mountains, for the whopping sum of $15 million. Okay? This was a real bargain. You think about it. In today's money, that's about $250 million. It's about $250 million. And so it is a huge amount of money. Don't get me wrong. But this was an incredible bargain. Napoleon had given up any dream France ever had of having a North American empire, and he wanted to sell this so that it would be able to finance his war effort in Europe. Now, part of this abandonment was because of a rebellion in Haiti, which was led by Toussaint Louverture. That had been unsuccessful, but it had killed a lot of French troops because of yellow fever. Okay, decision to sell Louisiana. He needed the cash. He didn't want to have to deal with the headaches. North America was not where he was headed. And so as a result, we had the opportunity of a lifetime, quite literally. What came to be known as the Louisiana Purchase was finalized on April 30th of 1803. And Thomas Jefferson, the strict constructionist, the man who believed that unless the Constitution told you had the right to do something, then it was forbidden, now had to argue with his own conscience because he questioned whether or not doing this was going to actually be constitutional. But again, it was one of those things that struck him as too good to pass up. So how does Jefferson deal with this dilemma? How does he deal with the fact that while there were some provisions for adding new states and things like that within the Constitution, there was nothing about buying foreign land? Remember, we mentioned before that Jefferson had to deal with the concept that the book reading and the book learning of government and reality were not always the same thing. That there were times that you had to figure out a way to compromise your beliefs in order to keep things going. And this is what he's having to look at in this particular case. Now, after considering an amendment to the Constitution, which in Jefferson's mind would have made everything, nice and even, he finally decided to go through with the deal anyway. Now, nothing in the Constitution talked about land purchase. This strict interpretation of the Constitution that he had been using for his whole life since the Constitution had come into existence, he was now using a loose interpretation. It wasn't so much that he was trying to flip-flop on his beliefs, but it was, as we've said before, a deal that was too good to pass up. This was going to help solidify America's future, and he was quite willing to go through and do that. Now, the Federalists, who normally took a very loose interpretation of the Constitution, now jumped to the strict interpretation. They opposed the purchase. They didn't want all this new land to come into existence because they foresaw incorrectly. They saw that what this meant was that if you had all of this new land, you're going to have settlers going out there. And with those new settlers, you're going to have new states. And within those states, you're going to have more farmers and more Republicans. You're going to have the ability for the Democratic Republican Party to really expand because so much of this land would be frontier farming. And the Federalists, they were very pragmatic about politics. They wanted their party to keep going, into the foreseeable future. And they knew that if this went through this particular way, that it would give an advantage not just to Jefferson, but to his entire party. And so, quite literally, as tends to happen in regards to politics, both parties made a full 180-degree turnaround from their previous philosophical beliefs about the Constitution. And they did so because of what was happening at the time. Both sides had really dug in their heels on how they felt about the Constitution and what was proper and improper. Now, because of the situation they found themselves in, both sides did a 180. Both sides had now reversed the position that they had dug their heels in upon. And it was all because what you read and what happens in reality are not always the same thing. In this case, it was good for the country at large, but both sides were still trying to play politics as a result. The Senate quickly approved the purchase with Jefferson's urging. And what essentially happened with the purchase of Louisiana is that the United States essentially doubled in size. Largest land bargain in history. And we basically paid about 3 cents an acre for it. This was a huge, huge real estate deal. You think about the size of the United States before this went from the Mississippi River to the East Coast. Now it's going to go from the East Coast essentially to the Rocky Mountains. Southwest is still going to be owned by Spain, but essentially the United States has just doubled. And while we did have that doubling of the population about every 20 years we talked about, this was going to provide the land that was seen as necessary for all those people to have some place to go.